Hey there, friends. Pastor Cliff Wall here with Clarksbury Church. Wanted to share a message with you about our Bible study, something from our Bible study called the Epic of Eden that we've been doing here at the church and live and in person. But great questions have come up, great discussion has come up during the time of this Bible study that we've had together, and I've been trying to share tidbits with you here via social media. Today I'm pre-recording this because I'm not going to be able to do a live stream with other things going on today, but in this later this afternoon. But I wanted to share this message with you, and a great question that just recently came up in light of something from my sermon this past week. Someone asked, where is Eden? What happened to Eden? Where did it go? Is it still here on the earth, or is it gone? Is it somewhere else? And that's a great question. It brings up a lot of things. So what happened to Eden? Where did it go? Well, we've seen how the Bible is telling the story of God's relationship with the people called Israel by way of a concept that was very familiar to them in their culture at that time, the concept of covenant. And we saw how there's a covenant called a suzerain covenant or suzerain treaty that would be made between a greater power and a lesser power, say a greater nation and a lesser nation. And often what would come as a part of that treaty or that covenant between people of unequal powers or great nations of unequal powers, part of what would come with that is called a land grant. And people would be given the opportunity to remain in their land, on their territory, and to benefit and to be blessed by that land as long as they were faithful to the terms of the covenant that they had made with that greater power. And this is how God forms this relationship with this people called Israel. But it's also part of the story of how God established a relationship with humanity in the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. A lot of times when we think of, when we hear the word earth in the Bible, a lot of times we automatically and immediately have this mind picture of a globe, the whole globe. But when the biblical authors are talking about the earth, most of the time they would have a very limited area of land in mind from our perspective. And so at any rate, when God planted, it says God planted the Garden of Eden in a specific location in what we call the Fertile Crescent, or the Mesopotamian region that's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And it would be a specific area within what we would call today modern day Iraq, or somewhere up in the eastern edge of Turkey, possibly the little country of Armenia. Some scholars have speculated. But the Bible tells the story of Eden as a specific location on the earth in which he planted it, and then he populated it with animals and created man, Adam, later created Eve. And then he gave human beings the responsibility of taking care of and dressing and keeping, guarding is another way to look at that, guarding the Garden of Eden. And they would enjoy the blessings and the beauty and the benefits of that land as long as they were faithful to the covenant that they had with God. So you still see that same pattern of the covenant that they were familiar with in the ancient world. And Eden would have been one of these, it was this place on earth where heaven and earth were in full communion. It was an intersection, if you will, of heaven and earth. And the presence of God, when we're talking about heaven, we're not just talking about the place above our head, we're talking about this dimension in which the presence of God fully dwells. And so God carved out this space, if you will, on earth called Eden, where his presence would fully dwell, and all of the blessings and the bounty and the beauty that would bring would be all the given to human beings to enjoy, but also to take care of, to steward, to protect. And the way that they could do that was being faithful to the covenant that they had with God. So we know that they weren't faithful to that covenant. They broke that covenant and they were expelled from the land. They no longer had the privileges and the benefits of being a part of that land. And once they were exiled, the Bible tells us in Genesis 2 and in Genesis 3 that God set up these supernatural beings called cherubim. These were creatures well known in the ancient world that represented supernatural beings who would protect the presence of kings and gods. And so the cherubim are protecting the presence of God. So the question is, what happened to Eden? Is Eden still there? Well, the physical location, I believe, is certainly there. But the bounty and the beauty and the paradise that it was because of the full presence of God is no longer a reality. I believe that what we would have seen as Eden and the beauty and the glory and the peace and the tranquility of it would have been taken back into the dimension that we call heaven and leaving a barren physical location here on earth, and that location getting back to heaven, if you will, on earth is not possible for human beings to achieve on their own. You know, so you think about in terms of a modern day resort, if you will. I used to see these commercials for this resort called Sandals. Some of you may have gone. I think a couple here in the church that recently got married went on a honeymoon and stayed in Jamaica at a Sandals Resort. And how awesome. I'm sure they had a great time, a wonderful time. But if you take all of the people out of Sandals Resorts who make the amenities and the entertainment and all of the luxury and the relaxation possible there, and who keep and maintain the properties, if you take all of those people out, it won't be long before that area that was once this resort would be like a ghost town. It would be all grown up and grown over, and maybe in 100 years or so, completely and totally undetectable to the human eye. So I think about Eden, and what made Eden what it was this interaction, this intersection between the heavens, the full presence of God that we call heaven, and earth. And all of that went back to heaven that made it the paradise that it was. And so the story of the Bible is the story of paradise lost and God going to work to make paradise once again a reality on the earth. So what we call Eden is now in the dimension that we call heaven, and it's no longer a reality on earth. And so if you think about Jesus' promise to one of the thieves on the cross that were crucified with him, who asked Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom, in Luke 23:43 there, Jesus promises the thief on the cross that because of his faith, he says, today you will be with me in paradise. That's Eden. Jews in that time contrasted what was called hell or Gehenna with Eden, and the paradise that is awaiting us in heaven that will be restored on earth. Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 talks about this vision he had where he was caught up to the third heaven, and that would be that dimension where the full presence of God dwells. That would be that dimension where when you enter into it, you're in the full presence of God. He also calls it paradise. And that's the word that Jews use to refer to the Eden that was lost. Now the place where that physical location was, it's still there, but the beauty and the paradise that was there because of the fullness of the presence of God is now taken back into this other dimension, if you will, and it is what God went to work to re-establish and reclaim himself for people on the earth. God created us in his image to bear his likeness and to share his blessing and stewardship of that creation. You know, in Eden, I believe, as many others believe, was originally a one little location on earth that God intended to spread throughout the whole earth, to spread throughout the whole globe, if you will. That was God's original intent. And when God reclaims and restores Eden on earth, where the full presence of God once again comes to dwell on earth, and this is the whole story of the Bible, that at that point, it will again begin in a specific location, and I believe from there will spread, in my view, around the globe until, as Isaiah and many of the other prophets said, some of the other prophets said, till the glory of God covers the earth as the waters cover the seas. So the full presence of God all around the globe. So, you know, I saw just a little bit ago somebody posted a meme on Facebook saying that it's a picture of the beach, and the meme said, "The beach fixes everything." And that really made me think about this topic here in terms of Eden. You know, once human beings were expelled from the garden and no longer had access to it, the consequences thereof God spells out for humanity in his sentence there that you read at the end of Genesis chapter 3. And part of that, I'll read it to you here from Genesis chapter 3, is God saying, he says, part of the consequences, he says, and to the woman, he said, in verse 16, "I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." There is the entrance of pain into the experience of humanity in this case, and also there's this tension that will develop between husbands and wives that will be the result of the fall. In verse 17 he said, "And to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you, and in pain you shall eat it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you." And I think that's an idiom just referring to the frustration of life. "And you shall eat the plants of the field." In verse 19, "And by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." There God is saying, look, you know, this is going to cause pain. This is going to cause frustration for humanity in this life. And when he's talking about working by the sweat of your brow, he's not just talking about how physical labor is going to be hard on the human body. He also is there. As Sandra Richter has pointed out, it's a metaphor, or what's called an idiom, if you will, that explains that humanity will face great uncertainty and unpredictability and unreliability and lack of trust amongst themselves, and therefore their labor will be done with tremendous worry and anxiety, never knowing if their efforts are going to produce enough to sustain their lives for them to be taken care of. But immediately thereafter, after the story of the exile and the pain and the frustration and the anxiety of life that sets in, God goes to work to restore Eden. That's the whole message of the Bible from beginning and to the end, is the project of God to restore paradise, to restore Eden, to restore heaven on earth. So I don't know about the beach. The beach may solve a lot of problems for a lot of people, but we don't really need to just go to the beach, as wonderful as that is, and wonderful as that is to enjoy. Where we really need to go is to our eternal home that God has waiting for us in the heavens, that He intends to restore on earth. We need to get back to Eden, and that will fix all problems. There will be the tree of life and the leaves thereof for the healing of the nations, where there will be a place there on earth where there will be no more pain and no more sorrow, no more frustration, no more anxiety and fear and worry, and no more uncertainty. That's the promise of the Scriptures. That is also the promise that's only a gift of God. The Bible also lays out for us another sad project. The Tower of Babel. Many scholars believe, and I agree, that the Tower of Babel represents humanity's efforts to reclaim Eden on their own. And I'll talk about that in another video later. But there's a sad project of humanity trying to reclaim the beauty and what the paradise of Eden on their own and on their own terms. But the true Eden of God that God has for us is only a gift that we can receive from Him through faith and trust in Him. We need the return of Eden, and Eden will come back when the King returns, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. He's going to bring Eden, the full presence of God, paradise on earth, back within when He returns. And the good news is for you and I, the hope that we have is that once we leave this world, before the return of Christ, if we die, then our soul will immediately go into the presence of God, into that paradise of God, and we'll experience it in heaven, and also when Christ returns, we'll experience it here again on earth. So where did Eden go? It went back to God, and it's held firmly and securely in God, and it will be restored to a faithful remnant when Christ returns. That's our hope. That's what we look forward to as Christians. That's the message of the Bible. God bless you and keep you, make His face shine upon you, lift up His countenance upon you, and give you His everlasting peace in the name of His Son, Jesus Christ, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Amen.